So the Channel 9 newspapers love running anti-religion stories. Now, I'm an atheist, right? But I'm also very aware that when they tried to run around with headlines today talking about how, parents don't want their kids to go to Scripture lessons, only 10% of them are actually going to them. Then you start reading through and you go, hang on, what are we talking about here? Oh, we're talking about a school in Marrickville. We're talking about a school in the middle of Albo's electorate, right? The one that if Albo wasn't there would be greener than green. Well, fewer than one-third of the schools had more than 33% of eligible students enrolled in religious education. Just 16 students, or 5% of those eligible, signed up to any form of religious education. This is, of course, at Parramatta, the other side of Sydney. But, oh, don't you love this here, Rebecca? Where, here we go, let's search for the evidence of the godless state. There was a thing called the census, a national survey where 70% of Australians said they believe in some sort of a deity. I'm not one of them. But the leftist media are of the belief that, well, most of those people are lying, right? So they would expect, and they go searching to assume that, no one wants to do Scripture because no one believes in a version of God. Problem is, it's not actually true.
No, well, that's right. And I think, it's very interesting. I was an article today was talking about how children born now may not live as long as, people who at this point in time are, living to 80 or 90 years old. And one reason they gave was sort of high youth suicide rates. And I would just point out that I think in a way, there's a lot of mocking of religion, and yet, a lot of these things really give people something to cling to. When you go through a really tough time, you'd be surprised how many people that's the moment when they turn, when things get really hard. And it may not be the answer, but for an awful lot of people, that is what gives you the resilience to get through hard times and to give a purpose and a meaning to life. And I think we turn around and say, oh, why are youth sort of feeling sort of so lost, and why do they run off and, go and, fall for this whole climate change thing? It's just, if you take away all of these values and structures that we've had for so long that help to give a sense of purpose to people, are you surprised when then people sort of turn around and kids turn around and feel like everything is meaningless?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Terry, we're in this world where, let's be very honest, right? Without, getting too 3 a.m. in the morning here, because I've had enough of those chats in the past few days. But without getting too 3 a.m. in the morning, part of the purpose of religion is to give moral certainty. It's about intellectualising the concept of death. It's about how you interrelate with other people. Now, I know that there's lots of people who move away from that being what informs their position, but, I mean, what annoys me about often much of the coverage of this stuff, Terry, is that the sneer is that if you believe in God, somehow you're dumb.
That's a very good point. And actually, it got me thinking. I always wanted to dodge Scripture lessons when I was in state primary school back in the 60s or late 60s, early 70s, because my mum was a Scripture teacher and I hated being in front of my mum. But beyond that, look, I actually think deep down this is a much more serious issue than what we're talking about and been obsessing about the last 2 months with Israel Palau, because this is all about freedom of religion, freedom of thought, freedom of choice, and effectively state schools wanting to shut down that freedom in terms of pupils and their families. So the freedom of worship actually means being able to take advantage of Scripture lessons where they're offered. And if that's the person's choice or the kid's choice and the family's choice, that's fine. If it's not, that's fine too. I don't see it. We're talking about half an hour a week if it's still the way it was when I was a kid. That's not much time at all. I think if you don't want to do your Scripture, you go and brush up on your books or whatever.
Yeah, with you completely. All right, speaking, of course, in and around matters to do with religion, we know religious freedom is still the issue that the government is trying to find a way to thread the needle, trying to find out the way to square the circle here, where Christian Porter has had this to say in the past couple of days. This would provide an overarching rule that places limitations on what an employer could do by way of general rules that affected all of their workforce. If those general rules, in an unfair and unreasonable way, had a negative or what the legislation calls a disadvantaging effect on a person of faith. So, what does this mean? It means if you sign a contract to promise you will or won't do or not do something, will or won't say something, will or won't post something. That's not what this is about. This is about trying to make sure that basically they can't turn around and say, hey, no Christians here. And you're not able to prove, and if you can turn around and prove no Christians here, well, that becomes an issue in and of itself. Is that going to be enough for you, Rebecca?
Well, I guess we'll just have to see what the legislation looks like. But I think that I don't think it's right to be able to sack somebody just because they're an evangelical Christian and they take seriously the teachings of evangelical Christians. You know, I just think that we should be able to have a society where people can be gay or they can be an evangelical Christian, and they should be able to respect each other, talk to each other, and not for one or the other of them to have to be sacked because of that. So I do hope that we'll provide something along those lines that will make it clear that Rugby Australia shouldn't sack one of their players simply for their beliefs, you know, and we know what the beliefs are of evangelical Christians. It's not like this is sort of like a new discovery. And I think when we signed up, you know, to the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and when we said we would protect religious freedom in this country, I think that's what it should do. I mean, I think in a multicultural society that there are some tricky issues, you know, when you look at it. And in Christianity, it is about love. Even if you say this is a sin, you always love the sinner and so on and so forth. But, you know, I feel quite uncomfortable with other religions which are much more violent, you know, about what they advocate. I think so long as it's not inciting people to violence, then I think there should be respect. But I think it's a tricky area.
Well, Terry, this is what... I mean, look, I don't know how else to put this because of the constraints of talking on television and trying to make it as crisp and clean as possible. But I think the thing that makes me anxious about religious freedom legislation is you can't assume it's always about your faith.
That's right. That's where I disagree with Rebecca, because, I mean, you can't just focus on Christianity. I mean, religious freedom applies across the board to Judaism, to Islam, to Calathumpianism, if you like, and probably even to Jedis if you go by the census. But seriously, I think it's an area that is fraught with dangers. But I think the basic principle should be, in the workplace as in life in general, that you should be able to express your personal and deeply held religious beliefs freely, but it should be also possible for people to criticise those beliefs in good faith freely. So I think one of the things that the last couple of months has said to me is that a lot of the tolerance in moral debates has disappeared. Maybe that's the fault of social media, maybe it isn't, but certainly the tone in which we have these conversations is not a very pleasant one, and I think that makes it hard for any government and opposition, if they cooperate with the government on this, to actually get it right.